In this video, I will be performing Les Tendres Plaintes by Jean-Philippe Rameau and also offer suggestions for its interpretation. Since I think it is helpful to be familiar with the piece before discussing it, this video will be structured as follows. First, you will listen to my performance of the piece accompanied by the score. Then I will concentrate on aspects of interpretation. And finally, you will listen to my performance of the piece one more time. Because I want the score to be as clear as possible in terms of readability, I am using a modern edition. And while I will address all interpretive aspects in more detail after the performance, for now, as you're listening along with the score, I want you to pay particular attention to two recurring details. First, in the opening refrain, the left hand plays certain leaps that span the interval of a tenth. Notice how some of them are slurred, meaning there is a curved line connecting the two notes, and some are not. And see if you can hear a corresponding difference in my performance. Secondly, notice how in several places throughout the piece there are two slurred notes forming a stepwise descent, with the second note having a trill sign above it. Here's an example in the right hand in measure 3. This is a particular ornament, but I'll talk about terminology later in the video. Once again, notice how I perform this ornament, although as with any ornament, I'm not aiming to play every instance of it in the exact same way. And now, let's listen to the piece. Les Tendres Plaintes is part of Rameau's Pièces de clavecin, first published in 1724, with a second edition following in 1731 and incorporating a few minor changes. Despite simply called Pièces de clavecin, this was actually Rameau's second collection of harpsichord pieces. The first one had appeared almost 2 decades earlier in 1706, when Rameau was only 23 years old, and was simply titled Premier Livre. The considerable time span between the two editions is reflected in the considerable differences of their contents. The 1706 collection commences with a prelude containing both an unmeasured and a measured section, followed by a series of predominantly dance movements, mostly in A minor. So while the term suite is not actually used, what we really have is a single suite in A minor. By contrast, the 1724 publication is a much larger collection of predominantly character pieces, although in a nod to tradition, it opens with an allemande followed by a courante, which loosely form 2 suites. The first one is in E and the second one in D. Notice I didn't mention major or minor because the pieces are kind of evenly divided between the 2 modes. Similarly to the 1706 collection, the word suite is not explicitly used. Les Tendres Plaintes is the first piece of the suite in D, and it is specifically in D minor. In terms of structure, it follows rondo form, which means there's a refrain alternating with contrasting sections. In this particular piece, there are 2 contrasting sections. Now, let's look at the 2 recurring details I told you to observe while listening to the piece, starting with the leaps spanning an interval of a tenth in the left hand. As you saw in the score, some of those leaps are slurred. In other words, there is a curved line connecting the 2 notes, and some are not. Delving a little deeper, if you examine the left hand line in the refrain, you will notice that Rameau is very meticulous with slurring the majority of various leaps, as well as certain 4-note groups. Let me show you for a brief moment the first line of the refrain, so you can observe what I mean. A slur normally implies connecting the notes it encompasses, and the way I interpret it is that, first of all, since the 4-note groups under a slur are arpeggiations of a triad, I hold down all the notes as long as I can before going on to the next group of notes. In other words, the first 4 notes that we have, which are under a slur, are simply a D minor triad. So what happens here, and what I would do, is something like this. Etc., etc. Think of it as equivalent to using the sustain pedal on a piano, only here we achieve the same effect with our fingers. For the 2-note slurs, I do something similar. In other words, I continue to hold the first note while playing the second one. So what I would do here, and let me play the first 4 measures, just the left hand. Notice what I'm doing with the 4-note slurs and also the 2-note slurs. You probably noticed that I used both hands for the leap of a tenth in measure 2. I did something like this, in other words. what happens here is that despite harpsichords having narrower keys than a modern piano, trying to slur two notes an interval of a tenth apart can be challenging for many performers. However, I think Rameau has actually thought this out quite carefully, because with one exception, which I suspect may be a misprint, all the leaps of a tenth that are slurred can be divided between both hands. And now what I want to do is change a little bit the camera angle so that you can see better exactly what I'm doing. For example, here is how you could play measure 2, and I'm demonstrating in slight slow motion. For the tenths that are not slurred, the distance between the two hands is too great to allow the right hand to play the top note of the tenth, and so, in my opinion, we don't need to worry trying to connect the two notes, especially since Rameau has not slurred them. However, I would still give more emphasis to the bottom note and make the top note a little shorter, so while not explicitly connecting the two notes, I'm still observing the hierarchy of the note on the beat being more important. For example, an unslurred tenth occurs in measure 10. This measure is identical to measure 2, except that now the left hand is playing an octave lower. So whereas in measure 2 we did this, in measure 10 we do this. There are two more tenths we encounter before the refrain's conclusion, and because the left hand continues to be an octave lower than before, neither of them can be played by using both hands. In the score, the first one is slurred, while the second one is not slurred. If we try to be consistent with what we've seen thus far, it seems to me that the slurred tenth may be a misprint or an oversight caused by the fact that the first time we encountered this exact passage in measure 5, the left hand had been an octave higher. In other words, measure 5 is this, and measure 13 is this. So personally, I play both of those tenths unslurred. And now here is the entire refrain in slight slow motion. The other recurring detail I asked you to observe concerns a particular ornament. In my opinion, the way to perform this ornament is not completely clear-cut. Or, to be more precise, if we refer to historical sources, there is enough ambiguity that I can see how the explanations on how to perform it could be interpreted in more than one way. As a matter of fact, the reason it took me a little longer to make this video was because I was trying to decide how to present this ornament in a concise way. So keeping in mind that addressing all the ambiguities of the historical sources would require an entire video devoted to this topic, what I'm going to do here is first present a brief overview of the ambiguity associated with interpreting this ornament. Then I will discuss how I choose to perform it based on my understanding of the historical sources and also why I think my interpretation may be what the historical sources are trying to describe. However, please keep in mind that, as with other aspects of historically informed performance, I am not implying that my interpretation is the only correct one or even the only one possible. So I hope that this presentation will serve as a means of further exploration. Let's go back to measure 3, which I had shown you at the beginning of the video, and let's look at it one more time. And more specifically, let's look at the first 2 notes in the right hand, which are slurred, with the second note also having a trill sign. One aspect of this ornament we can be certain of is how it differs from a regular trill. And in this regard, historical sources are pretty clear. Rameau provided a table of ornaments in the Pièces de clavecin, although interestingly enough, he included this particular ornament in a separate section devoted to slurs. What he has to say about it is this, quote, "If the second of the 2 slurred notes has a trill or a mordant, the first note serves as commencement of the respective ornament." End quote. Considering that a regular trill starts on the upper note, the difference between the 2 ornaments is this. And for one moment here, let me show you the 3 notes that we actually have to play. This third measure, without any ornamentation, consists of these 3 notes in the right hand. So E, D, and C sharp. The ornament sign is on the second note, which is a D. So while a regular trill in the second note of that passage would sound like this, when we have a slur, the upper note is to be held over from the previous note, so that now it sounds like this. So far, so good. But now, here comes the tricky part. Is the principal note supposed to be played on the beat or after the beat? In other words, if I were to play both hands together, are we supposed to do this or this? And what I did there is that the first time I played the principal note on the beat, and the second time after the beat. Here is where I think there's a slight ambiguity in how this ornament is explained. Rameau's written explanation seems to suggest that the principal note comes after the beat, since he states that the first note, which is the upper note, serves as a commencement to the ornament. In other words, we start with the upper note on the beat, but we don't actually hear it because it is tied over from the previous note. However, Rameau also explains how this ornament is to be played using musical notation. And in his example, the principal note appears to occur on the beat. So, at least the way I read it, there seems to be a discrepancy between Rameau's written and notated explanations. If we look to other contemporary sources for clarification, we find that François Couperin, for instance, in the table of ornaments he provided in his first book of Pièces de clavecin, he includes two different ornaments involving slurred notes. However, the one that pertains to what we see in Les Tendres Plaintes is the one he calls tremblement lié sans être appuyé, which can be translated as slurred trill without a held appoggiatura, and his example clearly shows the upper note held over so that the principal note occurs after the beat. The reason I dwell so much on the interpretation of this ornament is because I think there's a crucial expressive difference between the two ways of performing it. If we play it by placing the principal note on the beat, then for all practical purposes, it sounds like starting a regular trill on the principal note. In other words, doing this, which is the way trills came to be performed during the 19th century, with this manner of playing trills retroactively applied to Baroque repertory. Incidentally, to my knowledge, this type of trill is not found in any table of ornaments of French Baroque music. Why does this matter so much? If we refer back to the third measure of Les Tendres Plaintes, considering that the melodic line is this, starting the trill on the upper note creates a slight disruption, a little wrinkle in the melodic fabric, if you will, because it delays the arrival of the melody note. This disruption is maintained whether the upper note is actually played, like in a regular trill, or tied over from the previous note, like in the slurred trill we see in measure 3. And let me now play it with the left hand together. Here's a regular trill. Here is a slurred trill with the principal note coming after the beat. And now here is the same thing again with the principal note coming on the beat. So this is the contrast here. If we start the trill on the principal note, it serves to confirm and reinforce the melodic line. And it is perhaps not surprising that during the 19th century, whose musical aesthetic placed more emphasis on melody, it is this type of trill that became dominant. Of course, ultimately, we're talking about very fine margins here, but I think that when it comes to expression in music, it is such fine margins and subtle nuances that can make all the difference. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy listening to the piece one more time.